I'll give you 100K if you serve me in Chinese. The Velvet Ember pulsed with quiet luxury that night. Crystal chandeliers glowed like frozen fire, and violins whispered above the hum of whispered deals. Every table was dressed in silver and confidence. Then the doors opened and Edward Langston walked in. The air shifted. Conversations lowered. Cameras from the Beijing business delegation followed his every move. He was the kind of man who carried arrogance the way others carried perfume. Thick, deliberate, impossible to ignore. Amara Collins stood near the bar, balancing a tray of wine glasses, her posture straight, but her eyes distant. She had served dozens of powerful men before, but something about Edward's smirk told her this night would be different. He waved her over with 2 fingers, the gesture of a man used to obedience. As she approached, he leaned back in his chair, voice dripping with mock amusement. "Tell me something, sweetheart," he said, pulling a leather wallet from his coat. The delegation chuckled softly, sensing a show. Edward placed a crisp stack of bills on the table, $100,000. "If you can serve me in Chinese," he said, his grin widening, "this is yours." The room fell silent. Even the pianist paused mid-note. Amara's hands trembled around the tray. Laughter flickered among the suits. She glanced at the money, then at him, the man who thought humiliation was entertainment. Her heartbeat slowed, not in fear but in focus. And when her eyes met his again, there was no hesitation, only a spark of something dangerous. Long before the Velvet Ember's polished floors reflected her footsteps, Amara Collins was known by a different title, Dr. Amara Collins, professor of linguistics at Columbia University. Her lectures filled hallways with life. Students called her the polyglot poet, a woman who could shift between languages like wind through curtains, fluent in 9 tongues, each one flowing with ease and warmth. She spoke not just with words, but with purpose. Her work on cross-cultural communication was cited around the world. Back then, her world smelled of chalk dust, old books, and freshly brewed coffee. But brilliance does not protect anyone from heartbreak. It began one quiet morning when the phone rang during her office hours. The nurse's voice was calm but heavy. Her mother, Clara, had suffered a severe stroke. The drive to the hospital felt endless. Machines beeped, doctors whispered, and for the first time, language failed her. There were no words that could undo what had happened. Clara had always been her anchor, a librarian who taught her the beauty of every sentence, the rhythm of learning. Now she lay motionless, her once lively eyes closed, her hand barely moving when Amara whispered stories in the languages they used to practice together. The next few months became a blur of hospital corridors and medical bills. Her father had passed away years ago, and there was no family left to share the weight. The savings she once set aside for research were gone within weeks. Grants did not cover caretaking. Insurance refused coverage on technical grounds. Each conversation with the billing department chipped away at her composure. Amara sold her car first, then her rare books, then the piano her mother had loved. With every loss, the world grew smaller, her once bright apartment now an echo of itself. She continued teaching for a while, showing up to class with tired eyes but a steady voice. Yet exhaustion has a way of catching up. When her mother's condition worsened, she requested leave. The university granted it, temporarily, but academia moves on quickly. Budgets shifted. Her position was reassigned. When she tried to return, polite apologies replaced open doors. "We would love to have you back someday," they said. Someday never came. Months passed. Job applications went unanswered. Her credentials, once a badge of honor, now seemed like weights dragging her down. "Overqualified," they said. "We are looking for someone with more practical experience." The irony stung. She had taught diplomats and CEOs how to communicate across cultures, yet now she struggled to be heard. Her mother's care home fees kept rising. Amara took whatever work she could find, tutoring, translation gigs, even helping tourists navigate the city. Each rejection stripped away another layer of her former self. Her professional wardrobe faded into thrift store simplicity. Her confidence fractured into silence. One rainy evening, after another interview ended with an apologetic smile, she passed by the Velvet Ember. The restaurant's golden glow spilled onto the sidewalk. Soft piano music drifting through the glass. Something about the warmth inside felt like a refuge. She stepped in, not as a guest, but as a job seeker. "Any openings?" she asked the manager, her voice steady despite her soaked coat. They needed a waitress. The pay was modest, the hours long, but it was work. Her first night on shift, she wore the black uniform, pressed, plain, and anonymous. The dining room sparkled with laughter, wealth, and deals spoken in languages she once analyzed for cultural nuance. Now she simply served the wine. Her movements were graceful, almost academic, every tray balanced with quiet precision. The staff liked her calmness. The guests barely looked at her. Yet beneath that calm exterior, something fierce remained. Every night, as she counted tips beside the sink, her mind whispered in French, Mandarin, Arabic, the voices of her past reminding her who she had been. No one in the Velvet Ember knew the truth. The woman refilling their glasses once lectured on international diplomacy. The waitress they barely noticed could understand every private conversation they had in foreign tongues. Still, Amara kept her secret. She had learned that brilliance often unsettles those who cannot match it. Better to stay invisible, for now. But invisibility is a fragile disguise. And as Edward Langston's arrogant challenge echoed through the restaurant that night, something within her began to stir. The buried spark of the woman who once spoke to the world. The laughter rolled through the restaurant like smoke, thick, lingering, suffocating. Edward Langston leaned back in his velvet chair, a smirk pulling at his mouth as his Beijing delegation watched with amused curiosity. The chandelier light caught the rim of his glass as he swirled his wine, his voice slicing through the room. "So, Amara," he drawled, dragging out her name as though tasting it. "Tell me, do you really understand? Do you really understand the people you serve? Or do you just memorize fancy words from books? You people learn words, not wisdom." The words stung more than the money he had tossed across the table earlier. $100,000, spread carelessly over white linen, gleamed like bait. His tone dripped arrogance, each syllable meant to humiliate her in front of the delegation. Men and women who had come to discuss billion-dollar deals, not the dignity of a waitress. Whispers fluttered between tables. Waiters froze mid-step. Someone chuckled nervously. Amara stood still, the silver tray in her hand trembling slightly. Inside her chest, something heavy pressed against her ribs, that old, familiar ache of being underestimated. She had felt it in boardrooms, in classrooms, in every space where brilliance was met with disbelief. But this moment was different. This was not an academic insult. It was a public degradation, dressed as entertainment. Edward's laughter filled the silence again, louder this time. "Come now," he continued. "You studied languages, did you not? Impress us. Say something wise in Chinese." The insult was sharp, deliberate, a test disguised as mockery. For a moment, Amara looked down at the bills on the table, crisp, untouched. She saw not the money, but the reflection of her mother's fragile face in her mind. Clara, who used to tell her that silence is a language too. But sometimes silence must end. She inhaled slowly, steadying her breath. The restaurant's murmur dimmed until all she could hear was the faint tick of the ornate clock on the wall and the clinking of a glass somewhere in the distance. Then she looked up. Her eyes met Edward's, calm, clear, no anger. No fear, only resolve. "I accept," she said softly. Her voice did not rise, yet it carried across the room like a command. The laughter stopped instantly. The delegation turned in unison, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Even the pianist hesitated mid-note, letting the silence stretch. Edward's smirk faltered just slightly. He leaned forward, studying her face as though he had misheard. "You accept?" Amara nodded once, her expression unreadable. "If you want me to serve you in Chinese," she said, "then I will." The quiet around them deepened. The only sound was the rhythmic tick of the clock above the bar, steady, deliberate, like the countdown to something no one yet understood. The delegation exchanged glances, their amusement replaced with intrigue. Something in the air shifted, from mockery to anticipation. Edward chuckled, trying to regain control of the moment. "Very well, Miss Collins," he said, leaning back again. "Let us see what you can do." But as the reflection of her face glimmered faintly in the polished wine glass beside him, Amara's eyes carried a quiet fire. This was no longer about the challenge. It was about reclaiming everything the world had taken from her: dignity, worth, and voice. Edward's smirk deepened as he leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. "Go ahead then," he said. his tone soaked in mockery. "Show us what your textbooks taught you." His voice carried easily through the still air of the velvet ember, each word designed to sting. The Beijing delegation watched with a mix of curiosity and quiet amusement. Some whispered softly in Mandarin, exchanging polite smiles, expecting a clumsy attempt, a waitress fumbling her way through a language far beyond her reach. Cameras hovered. Glasses clinked faintly. Every sound in the restaurant felt sharper now, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Amara stood motionless for a moment. The white linen of the table, the shimmer of wine glasses, the faint reflection of the chandelier above. It all blurred into silence. Inside her mind, however, another world stirred. She was no longer standing in front of Edward Langston. She was back in the classroom at Columbia University, sunlight spilling across the chalkboard, students hanging on her every word. She could still hear the rhythm of her own voice explaining the beauty of tonal languages, the delicate shifts that turn sound into meaning. Then her mother's voice echoed faintly in memory. "Never let knowledge bow to arrogance, Amara. The world may not value it, but it will always set you free." The words settled deep inside her, like steady hands on trembling shoulders. She took one quiet breath, then straightened. The tray she held no longer shook. The tremor in her hands faded. Her shoulders lifted, her chin rose, and when she reached for the wine list from Edward's table, there was no hesitation. Edward chuckled softly, mistaking her calm for surrender. "You may start whenever you are ready," he said, lifting his glass as though to toast her failure. But Amara was already ready. Her voice came out low, graceful, and in perfect Mandarin. She began, describing the evening's special, beef tenderloin with truffle and red wine glaze. Each syllable rolled off her tongue with precise tone and natural cadence, the kind that only comes from years of immersion. The delegation fell silent. Forks stopped midair. Amara continued, her tone warm and unhurried, explaining the flavors, the textures, and the delicate balance of the chef's craft, all in fluent professional Mandarin. Then, seamlessly, she transitioned into describing the matching wines, naming each vineyard with accuracy and grace. Edward's smirk wavered, but he tried to keep his composure. "Not bad," he said lightly, glancing around at the delegation. She must have practiced that one line all week. But Amara did not stop. She lifted her eyes to meet his, and in flawless pronunciation switched to another dialect, Cantonese. "The soul of this dish lies in patience. Only those who understand waiting can truly taste it." A few of the Chinese investors gasped quietly. The elegance of her tone, the fluidity of her accent. This was no memorized phrase. This was mastery. A shift rippled across the table. One of the delegates, a silver-haired businessman, leaned closer, murmuring to his interpreter, "She speaks better than some of our diplomats." The laughter that once filled the room had vanished completely. The only sound now was Amara's voice, weaving through tones and textures like music. She set down the wine list, calm and confident. Her eyes held a quiet authority, the kind born not from pride but from truth. Edward forced another smile, but the edges of it had begun to crack. His eyes darted toward his guests, seeing admiration. For her, not him. The power he had wielded moments ago was slipping, piece by piece. And yet Amara was not done. Her Mandarin softened again, this time almost poetic as she described the meaning behind a simple cup of tea: humility, patience, respect. Every word landed with quiet precision, like pebbles rippling across still water. The delegation sat transfixed. In that silent, glittering restaurant, Amara Collins was no longer a waitress in a black uniform. She was a scholar, a master of language, and the very embodiment of grace under pressure. And as Edward Langston watched her with a frozen smile, one thought flickered behind his eyes. The air inside the velvet ember felt electric, heavy with silence and disbelief. Every pair of eyes was fixed on Amara Collins. She stood tall beside the table, her black uniform a quiet disguise for the brilliance she had just unleashed. But she was not finished. Her voice flowed again, this time shifting into Cantonese. The transition was effortless, seamless, like the movement of water finding its course. The words carried rhythm, melody, and weight. Her pronunciation was sharp yet graceful, her tone controlled, every phrase hitting like a note in a symphony. The Beijing delegation sat in stunned silence. No one dared to move. A few of them exchanged looks, the kind that said this was no ordinary woman. What began as entertainment had turned into revelation. Edward Langston, however, tried to laugh it off. "Impressive," he said, forcing a smirk. "You must have spent all your free time memorizing these lines." His tone was light, but there was something strained beneath it, a crack forming in his confidence. Amara did not answer. She simply continued, her voice now flowing into Taiwanese Mandarin. The tonal precision, the idiomatic depth, the emotional rhythm, it was artistry. Each sentence revealed years of mastery, not mimicry. The soft rise and fall of her words painted pictures no translation could capture. One of the investors, a middle-aged man with rimless glasses, began to clap softly. Another joined him, and then another. Within seconds, the applause spread through the room, slow and respectful. It was not loud. It was reverent. Edward's smile vanished. His fingers tightened around the stem of his wine glass. He was no longer in control of the moment. Amara placed the wine list gently on the table. The applause faded into expectant silence. She looked at Edward, calm, steady, eyes glowing under the chandelier's reflection. Then in perfect English, her voice cut through the tension. "You once offered money for a language," she said quietly. "But some of us built our lives studying it." No one spoke. The words hung in the air like truth that could not be undone. Then she straightened, her tone even and composed. "My name is Dr. Amara Collins," she said. PhD in Linguistics, Columbia University. Author of Linguistic Bridges. Former professor. The shock that followed was visible. Gasps, wide eyes, a ripple of disbelief spreading across the table. The delegation looked from her to Edward, then back again. The man they had admired minutes ago now looked small beside her. Edward opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His face had gone pale, the smugness drained away completely. His hand trembled slightly as he set down the glass he was holding. Amara took one quiet step closer, her voice still soft but unwavering. "Knowledge, Mr. Langston," she said, "is not something you can buy. But humility is something you can learn." The room went still again. Even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed to pause. For a moment, all anyone could hear was the slow ticking of the clock on the far wall, the same clock that had marked every second of this silent duel. Edward's eyes darted around the table, searching for support, but none of his guests met his gaze. The delegation's expressions had shifted, from amusement to disapproval. One of them leaned toward another, whispering something under his breath that made the rest frown. It was over. Amara did not need to say anything more. Her words had already rewritten the room's balance of power. She stood tall, not as a waitress, but as the woman she had always been. A scholar, a teacher, a daughter who had never let knowledge bow to arrogance. As she turned to leave, the investors rose to their feet, not for Edward, but for her. The applause returned, this time stronger, filled with respect. Edward sat frozen in his chair, unable to meet her eyes. The stack of money he had thrown earlier lay untouched on the table, now nothing more than paper beside the weight of what she had just proven. Justice did not need anger that night. It arrived in the form of a quiet woman reclaiming her name. And in that silence, everyone understood. The humiliation had flipped, and Amara Collins had won without ever raising her voice. Days passed, but the echo of that night at the Velvet Ember did not fade. It moved through Manhattan like a whispered legend, the waitress who spoke 9 languages and silenced a billionaire. The Beijing delegation returned home, but the story followed them, spreading through boardrooms and business networks. By the end of the week, Edward Langston's empire began to shake. The investors who once sat beside him withdrew their offers, citing ethical concerns. Contracts that had taken months to negotiate dissolved overnight. News outlets caught the story. Headlines painted Edward not as a visionary, but as a man undone by his own arrogance. He tried to deny it at first, but the world had already chosen its narrative. The video footage, discreetly recorded by a guest that evening, went viral. Millions watched Amara Collins stand tall in her black uniform, her calm voice cutting through humiliation with grace and power. For Amara, life shifted quietly. She did not chase the fame that followed, but it found her anyway. Invitations arrived from universities, cultural organizations, and media outlets. Then came a message from an international tech linguistics company. They had seen her viral moment and wanted her to lead their global communications division. The irony was poetic. A woman once mocked for her knowledge was now being offered a position that celebrated it. She accepted the role not for prestige but for purpose, to build bridges between languages, the very dream that had guided her long before the world forgot her name. One soft morning, sunlight filtered through the hospital window as Amara sat beside her mother. Clara's hand rested in hers, warm and steady for the first time in months. The doctor smiled as he shared the news. Her condition had improved beyond expectation. Clara opened her eyes, weak but aware, and whispered, "You kept your promise." Tears welled in Amara's eyes, but this time they were not from exhaustion or fear. They were from peace. The fight was over. Back home, Amara stood before a small box on her dresser. Inside lay the black uniform she had worn every night at the Velvet Ember. She smoothed her fingers over the folded fabric, not with bitterness, but gratitude. It had witnessed her lowest point and her greatest triumph. She closed the box, gently, and placed it on the top shelf, never to be opened again. Outside, the city glowed in the distance. The same city that had once broken her spirit now mirrored her rise. For the first time in years, Amara felt free. From humiliation to empowerment, from silence to recognition, her journey had come full circle. And as the day unfolded beyond the window, she whispered softly to herself, "Knowledge does not bow. It rises." Morning light spilled through the tall glass doors as Amara stepped into her new office. The building shimmered with clean lines, of silver and glass, reflecting the skyline she had once only admired from the outside. Now she walked through it, steady, confident, free. The air smelled of new beginnings, not of champagne or polished tables, but of purpose. As she passed the rows of desks, employees looked up, curious about their new director. She smiled politely, not out of pride, but quiet gratitude. Every step reminded her of the nights she had walked home from the restaurant in the cold, whispering to herself that one day things would change. And now they had. Standing by the window, she looked down at the streets of Manhattan, the same streets where she had once carried trays unseen and unheard. Her reflection in the glass seemed older, wiser, and unbroken. A soft voice filled her thoughts, one she could almost hear as her mother's. When life drags you down, remember, dignity is not measured by your job title or your uniform, but by the courage to stand tall when the world expects you to bow. Those words stayed with her. They were not about revenge or proving anyone wrong. They were about reclaiming her sense of worth, something no one could ever take again. That night, as the city lights blinked awake, another scene unfolded somewhere else. Edward Langston sat alone at a bar, his reflection blurred in the glass of half-finished whiskey. The television above him played a business segment. His company officially bankrupt, his investors gone. The man who once threw money to humiliate, others now stared at a bill he could no longer afford to pay. But the story did not end with his downfall. It ended with hers, standing beneath the bright lights of a global conference stage, her voice calm and confident. "Good evening," she said, smiling at the audience. "My name is Dr. Amara Collins." And with those words, the story came full circle. Not about wealth or power, but about grace, resilience, and the quiet strength of a woman who chose dignity over despair. Because true redemption does not come from watching someone fall. It comes from rising and never looking back.